Welcome, everyone. We'll give it just a couple more minutes to let people continue logging on. Okay, we are right at noon, so I'm going to begin this program. My name is Adrienne Burney. I'm the outreach coordinator for the State Archives, and we are very fortunate today to have lead researchers on the Rail project share some of their new discoveries with us. I also, before we get into that program, I want to invite you all to make your own discoveries at the State Archives. We have a headquarters building in Raleigh and 2 branch archives in the West in Asheville at the Western Regional Office and in Marion at the Outer Banks History Center. At all 3 locations, we welcome researchers 5 days a week in Raleigh, Tuesday through Friday, 9 to 5, and Saturdays, 9 to 1, and at the branches, Monday through Friday, 9 to 5. So please come visit us. We also have a vast digital collection growing all the time, and audiovisual materials on Flickr and YouTube. So you can explore our collections from the comfort of your home as well. We will be recording today's session and posting it on YouTube as soon as possible, and we'll send that link out to all registrants so that you can share with your colleagues who were not able to attend on a Friday afternoon. And now I just want to remind everyone to don't be shy about posting questions and comments in the chat and the Q&A. Dr. Waters and I will try to moderate those questions, and hopefully our presenters will have a little time at the end of their stories to answer those questions. So next, I want to introduce to you Dr. Darin Waters. He's the Deputy Secretary for the Department of Natural and Cultural Resources and the Director of the Office of Archives and History. Before joining our department in 2021, he directed the Office of Community Engagement at the University of North Carolina, Asheville, where he was also a history professor. And he was one of the original board members of the Rail project. So now I'll turn it over to him so you can hear more about that, and he can introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Adrienne. I hope everyone can hear me. My connection is a little choppy today. I am actually in the western part of the state, been at the for a while this morning and was at the Western Regional Office visiting with staff there. So it's good to be here on the call with you all. So I hope that you are getting a good connection and you can hear me. You know, I'm going to be introducing a very dear friend here, Dr. Daniel Pierce. Dr. Pierce was one of the first people that I met when I came back to Asheville years ago. Asheville is home for me. When I came back here in the late, I guess, 2008, 2009, around that year when I began doing my own dissertation research about the development of the African-American community here in Asheville. And Dan, department at UNC Asheville. He was the chair of the department of the Mountain South Distinguished Professor of History at UNC Asheville. And I know that the students there love him. I was on campus briefly yesterday and someone mentioned Dan's name. I didn't get a chance to see him, but I think that you're going to be deeply enriched by what he has to say about this particular project. This project, the Rail Project, really is a labor of love for Dan and all who have been involved. And the one thing that you'll know about Dan is that he is someone who is deeply committed to truth telling in history. He knows, kind of like one of my other mentors, John Hope Franklin, that in order for us to move ahead, that we have to get some of these old false narratives that we have about our past corrected. And Dan is someone who's been deeply involved in that, not only as it pertains to African-American history, but to histories of people in general, and especially when we think about the history of Southern Appalachia. And so this is a project that Dan began to work on around the incarcerated labor that helped to build and complete the railroad which connected Western North Carolina. And so I am deeply, deeply honored to be able to introduce Dan today. And I could go on more, but I don't want to take up his time and the other panelists. So I want to go ahead and turn this over to Dan, Dr. Dan Pierce. And Dan, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, Darin. Good to see you there. I appreciate that so much. But this is, I want to give you a little background on the rail project, and then my colleague Steve, who Darin will introduce a little later, will talk about his work in the archives. So anyway, let me share screen here and talk about what's been going on for the last 4 years or so, 4.5 years, related to my neighborhood. I live at Ridgecrest, right at the top of the mountain, and have a long history with this area. It's how Steve and I got to know one another through a boys' camp here. But we both have had an interest in Steve much longer than I, but in the railroad. And there are hiking trails and biking trails and things that parallel the railroad tracks. And this is something I've thought about for a long time, and considered what it took to bring the railroad up the mountain. Just to show you a map here, this gives you an indication of from just above Old Fort at what was called Henry Station to the top of the mountain at Ridgecrest. And you can see the loops in the track that it took to maintain the grade coming up the mountain. There are 6 tunnels in this stretch. There's one a little further down. And so this was one of the most amazing engineering feats and this took place in the 1870s and in the late 1870s. And so this was, again, it's still, railroad buffs will come from all over the world to see this site and watch trains come up it. And it's just an iconic, anyone who's a railroad buff knows about what some people call the Swannanoa grade, or just this stretch of railroad roughly from Old Fort up to the top of the mountain near Black Mountain. But you can see at the bottom of the screen there, you can see this is roughly the route of I-40 right here. So it's about 3.5 miles from Old Fort to Ridgecrest, but it's over 8 miles of track to get up the mountain. So again, this was, and huge obstacles that had to be overcome in order to do this. This was all done, all the labor was done by convicts and who were incarcerated in the North Carolina State Penitentiary. and then they were sent up the mountain to do labor on the railroad. So this is one of the major facts that really has not been there. There have been some, the book by John Ely, The Road, chapter in Wilma Dykeman's book, The French Broad, and a few other historical articles, work Steve Little did on this, but there wasn't a lot of public knowledge about the fact that this was all done by convicts. About 95% or so African American. One of the things that we have found a good deal of information about was the fact that many of these individuals were unjustly incarcerated, and one Ann Chesky came across this article in the Asheville Citizen, and it's pretty chilling. But I'll just read you the one line there. It said, "The supply of convicts at the penitentiary is not sufficient for the work of the railroad." And then it says, "And word will be sent out to the prosecuting officers to bring before the courts a larger number of offenders." And so, a lot of these individuals were arrested on, vagrancy, petty theft, those types of things. They were hauled into court, and the chances of an African American being acquitted in one of these cases was pretty slim, and they were generally convicted and sentenced to 3 years of hard labor and sent to work on the railroad. I should add too, one of the things is that this project or this section of the railroad, much of the railroad in Western North Carolina was built by corporations leasing convicts, but this section, what was called the Mountain Division of the Western North Carolina Railroad, was a state project. And don't have time to go into details. It was a very complicated. There was fraud and criminality involved. It took a long time. It was a very personal project for Zebulon Vance that he wanted to see through, and he pushed heavily for this. But again, this labor was done. It was headed up by Colonel James Wilson, and who was a very good engineer in terms of designing this project. But the big thing here was that the human cost of this project was huge. We know, and we may have new numbers from Steve about this, but from penitentiary records that were available prior to this year, actually a former student of mine did research on that and discovered that at least 139 of these convicts died in the process, and of course, many others who were injured in the work. It was very dangerous work. They were using nitroglycerin for the first time. There were rock falls. As you can see in this article, a jug of powder accidentally fired was the trouble and killed. There were a number of others killed trying to escape as well. This is one of the Round Knob. This is one of the main, what they call a stockade, where they house the prisoners. And that was another problem. They were, cheek by jowl in these cabins, packed into there, and communicable diseases. Of course, they're working in all kinds of weather, 6 days a week, daylight to dusk, and again, fed very little, mainly beans, and maybe occasionally some salt pork or something like that. But the conditions were horrible. As Steve said, this was their one suit of clothes. They didn't have coats. They didn't have, a lot of things. So in the cold and the heat and all this, conditions were very rough. There have been some memorials to the construction, primarily for, there's a memorial in Old Fort to James Wilson, recognizing his efforts and achievement. Unconnected, this is in the middle of that section, in a section where there's 3 loops in the track. But this is to an executive for the Southern Railroad by the name of Andrews, and this is what's called Andrews Geyser, which is a human-made geyser. So there is some memorial to the people who, or at least Andrews wasn't directly involved, but he was involved in the construction of the Western North Carolina Railroad all the way through to Murphy. So there was some recognition. The only recognition publicly that this was done by convict labor is this sign at the top of the mountain above the Swannanoa Tunnel, which is the last tunnel and is one of the longest tunnels east of the Rockies. And all it says is constructed by convict labor. And so the little or no acknowledgement. So in 2020, in July of 2020, Steve and I got together on my porch to talk about this. We were it was in the midst of the George Floyd. It was but it's something that both of us have been thinking about and hadn't really talked to one another about, but we have been thinking about for a long time, that there needed to be some sort of memorial. And so we formed a committee. We invited Dr. Waters and about 9 other folks to join us. It's pretty amazing that people just jumped right in to help out. And that's when the Rail Memorial Project began, which is Railroad Incarcerated Labor is the rail there. So the first thing we did was we got permission from the town of Old Fort to put up a memorial at a park at Andrews Geyser there. And these were our stonemasons who did that, Paul Twitty and Jimmy Logan. What you can't see there are just the touches in there. They incorporated railroad spikes into the stonework. It's really a neat thing. On the back are the names of we had some names at that time from census records from 1880 when they did the census. You can see and we'll put this in the chat, our website that we have, and would encourage you to visit that. There's the dedication. You can see Dr. Waters there at the dedication. We had a great day. We even had a train came through in the middle. One of our, the woman with her hand in the air had connections to the railroad, and we were able to get Norfolk Southern to run a train through there in the middle of the dedication. So that was a neat thing. We thought we were done at that point, but it turned out we weren't. And so just real quickly, I'll go through this. We connected with some folks who do ground penetrating radar and human remains detection dogs, because none of these graves were marked of the individuals that died. They were just generally buried next to the tracks, but we kind of had some ideas about where there might be human remains, and wish I had time to go into the story, but that Steve, had a kind of a tip about a place, and that was actually confirmed by the dogs and then by the ground penetrating radar there. So we discovered some sites, and then we started thinking about an additional project on this, and that turned into a memorial boulder to those that died we didn't put it at the site because it's on the property of the Ridgecrest Conference Center, and but this is next to the road across the interstate from the Ridgecrest Conference Center on Yates Avenue, and we got a 2-ton boulder and then a plaque to go on that to memorialize those that died. And we had just a powerful ceremony dedicating that. Our next thing that we've already got these panels. We're putting up 3 panels at the top of the mountain, right in the Swannanoa Gap, which will talk about the building of the railroad. They talk about the song Swananoa Tunnel. I'll talk just a tad about that here. And about the stockades and the camps and really the cost of this. And so those will be coming up soon. And so we'll have a dedication coming soon for that. And then lastly, I want to talk a little bit, of course, along the way, we have connected with a number of people who've had an interest in this, and we've several of our board members have been doing and are continuing to do active research. There's actually going to be an article in the North Carolina Historical Review coming up from Ashley Whittle, one of our board members. And Chesky's done a lot of research on this, and then Steve will be talking about his. But in the process of doing this work, we encountered Jeff Keith and Kevin Kerberg, who were at Warren Wilson College. And you can see the web address there. They did an article entitled "Somebody Died, Babe, a musical cover-up of racism, violence, and greed," which was in the Bitter Southerner back in 2020. It's an excellent article, and I highly recommend it. They've done some amazing research, including about this gentleman here who worked at Duke and actually recorded a song with the folklorists there, the song Swananoa Tunnel, and they've traced it back, which people looked at as an old time or kind of bluegrass song, but it's really a work song that was done by the workers as they were doing the labor coming up the mountain. But anyway, in the course of their research, Jeff was in the archives, and he noticed that when the archivist brought him a box, he didn't give him everything that was in the box. And so he asked him, he said, what's that still in the box? And he discovered that what I don't know that anyone really knew at that point, that there were records in there that had individual names. It had, and Steve will talk about the information that's in those records. But and so he obviously wanted to get access to those records, and so he started looking into how to do that, he and Kevin. And so they contacted Dr. Waters, and Dr. Waters and his staff did some research, discovered that in order to release those records, this would require legislation from the General Assembly. And so at that point, Jeff and Kevin reached out to local representative here, John Ager, and John and Darin might fill some more details in on this, but John was able to essentially kind of slip a bill into an omnibus bill and I'm not sure how many people actually read that part of it, but they were able to get it through, get it passed. And these new records, which actually give us names, give us what happened, were they released, were they pardoned, did they die, what happened to them. So Steve's going to talk about that. But this has been a very exciting development. And again, several people, Jeff and Kevin, of course, Steve has spent a good, more than a week looking at these records. Ashley Whittle's looked at these records, and it's an exciting thing to be able to kind of flesh out, because one of the things we wanted to do was to bring out the human story in this, and to help people to see that, as important an infrastructure project, there was a real human cost here that needs to be remembered. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to, I guess, back to Darin, and he'll introduce Steve. Let me unshare my screen.
Well, thank you, Dan, for walking us through where the project began and where we are now. In relation to your comment about getting that bill passed to get those records released, I also want to recognize the work that Sarah Kuntz, our state archivist, who may be on this call, who I imagine did with that as well. I was thrilled to find out that even before I joined the department, that there were conversations that were going on around this particular issue. So Sarah had already pushed that ball with her team in archives and records down the road. And I'm glad we were able to get it across the finish line. But I want to acknowledge and thank Sarah for the work that she and her team had done on that as well. Well, it gives me pleasure to also introduce Steve Little. It's been, my connection with Steve came through my connection with Dan, and I've just enjoyed and been thrilled to get to know Steve. Steve is the mayor of Marion, North Carolina, which work that keeps him very busy. But it's been great to see Steve the past few weeks, quite often in the state archives, in the research room doing research. And so without further ado, I want to turn now the floor over to Steve, so Steve can carry us through the work that he is continuing to do on this project. Steve, welcome. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you, Darin. It's a delight for me to be here. This project is something that I've been working on. This is not an exaggeration to say 50 years. I first got interested after reading John Ely's book, The Road. And after I read that, because I had been at summer camp at Camp Ridgecrest, which is, as Dan said, where he and I got acquainted, I knew the area and it resonated with me. So when I had to pick my history thesis at Wake Forest for my history major, I wrote on the construction of the Mountain Division, which was that section that Dan showed in the map between just west of Old Fort and the western portal of the Swannanoa Tunnel up at Ridgecrest. And of course, in doing that, my research led me into old records from the 1870s that I found in Wake Forest Library of an investigative report. Politics this is nothing new that politics is nasty and bad, because in 1877, there were allegations made of mismanagement of the construction. The construction started in 1875 when the state of North Carolina purchased the bankrupt Western North Carolina Railway Company at a bankruptcy sale, because since the 1830s, it had been the state policy to establish a trunk line railroad all the way from Wilmington on the coast, which, by the way, was the largest city in North Carolina in the 1870s, for good reason, because it was the port city, but all the way from there to the Tennessee line. And they made it as far as the Blue Ridge Escarpment, the point where the Piedmont joins the mountains. That's what this 3.5 mile line on the map represents. That section where the mountains jump up into the sky, into the land of the sky, where the Piedmont meets it, rises 1,002 feet in 3.5 miles. So that's the reason the railway has to loop around as much as it does to climb that grade. But until Major James W. Wilson came around, he was a railroader from North Carolina, and he had the knowledge and experience from an engineering perspective to do this. So he knew what to do. The state of North Carolina, keep in mind, this was 10 years after the Civil War. There were so many people, so many men and boys who were killed or injured in the Civil War that there was not much workforce available. So who was going to build it? Not only that, but who's going to pay for it? The state had so many financial needs and they were essentially broke. So the state of North Carolina solved both of those problems with one decision: turn to the prison of North Carolina to supply the labor and pay them nothing. And that's exactly what they did. The first shipment of convicts was sent in October of 1875. 35 men crammed in a boxcar, shackled together with at their ankles and at their wrists in groups of 5 on a 2-day trip where they were not permitted to get out. There was a hole in the floor in the corner for necessary purposes. You can imagine what that's talking about. And they had water and hoe cakes to eat for 2 days. They get out, and their first job is to clear some land and build a stockade. While they were doing that, they had to get back into the boxcar to sleep at night. And this took several weeks of doing. They built this. Once the stockades were built, more convicts came. Within the first 8 months, and this is documented precisely in various legislative records, a total of 300 men, and all but about 8 were Black men, and 16 women, all of whom, of course, were Black. No white women were involved in this process. That many were shipped, so that by the end of 8 months, there were 316 convicts living in these stockades. The women had the little hut, the men had the bigger section. And they began their work. More convicts would come because more were needed. They had to clear out a path 15 feet wide, had to be smooth, trees had to be cut down, bushes had to be pulled up, rocks had to be moved out of the way or pounded down. And the state was the owner of the company because they had bought it at the auction sale for the bankruptcy. So the state had custody of the convicts. The state owned the company. The state didn't have the money to produce a lot of tools. Some they had to have. They had to have sledgehammers. What they didn't have to have was shovels. Now you would think they would, but what they used instead were flat rocks, which the convicts had to find themselves and use to pound down on the edge to dig, and then they would scrape, dig, scrape. And that's what they did for their tools largely. This was an incredibly difficult task. And it went, as Dan indicated, in all weather conditions. They had to move forward. After that happened, they had to use the trees that were available, primarily white oak, to make cross ties. They had to get gravel. When they get gravel, what that means is they get rocks and they pound the big rocks and turn them into little rocks. You couldn't call somebody or contact somebody and say, how about bringing me in a dump truck load of gravel? No, there was no such thing, of course, and no mechanism mechanized anything during this process. It's been documented in some of these legislative documents, including particularly 2 reports, one in 1877, one in 1879, where legislators doing investigations came up and actually spent time watching, looking, observing the convicts doing their work to see if things were being mismanaged or if it was done properly. The whole system that was being used was changed about midway for the better. It was basically a committee starting out doing it. And then the second half, Major Wilson was in charge, and things went a whole lot smoother after that happened. There was constant conflict, however, because there were people from the railroad side who were supervisors, and yet there were also prison guards. And sometimes the prison guards would give an instruction to a convict that would vary from what the railroad manager had told him to do. So what are you going to do? you're in a quandary. You're going to get punished no matter what you do. Their life was constant anxiety, constant stress, brutality, severe conditions. And I'm going to give you a few quotes from some of these legislative reports. One of them states, included in the material, the convicts leave the stockades for work as early as a man can be distinguished and returns at sunset. So they worked all day long. There was no visible daylight time where they were not at work. Here's another comment when one of the committees happened to be there in February. The day the committee was present inspecting the work in the quarters, there were 45 hands standing idle under the pretext that the weather was too severe for work, an explanation with which your committee was not at all satisfied. For the snow upon the ground was no impediment to work in the tunnels. So there could be 6 to 8 to 12 inches of snow, and the officials were saying, that's not a reason not to work. They can do all the work in the tunnels. Well, that reflected a lack of knowledge by the commissioner, by the committee members, not understanding what's involved in digging a tunnel. So let's speak about that just for a moment. The shortest tunnel was 87 feet long. The longest tunnel, and there were 7 tunnels that were constructed. The longest was 1,832 feet long. That's 6 football fields end to end. So long that Major Wilson had one crew working from the McDowell County side. The county line, of course, was roughly in the middle. And another crew working from the Buncombe County side, working toward the middle. These tunnels had to be 15 feet wide, had to be 15 feet tall, and they were solid rock. Solid rock. No dirt was in here. Not in any of these tunnels. The convicts who had big biceps would come in with these sledgehammers and they would pound. They would get some help from black powder or gunpowder. And then they got some help from nitroglycerin. The first use of nitroglycerin in the southeastern United States was in these tunnels. It was a volatile substance, not reliable, not dependable, not stable, but Major Wilson instructed the convicts to mix very carefully a little bit of sawdust and a little bit of cornmeal with the nitroglycerin to make it into a sort of a paste or a mash type thing. And then they would pound holes into the rock and pour in some of this, and then they would get leaves for a fuse and light it and run like crazy to get out of the tunnel, and then it would explode. Keep in mind also the fear of these convicts. Many were afraid that because this was going on in the bowels of the earth, that this noise, this ruckus, was going to wake up Satan, who would come up and snatch away their souls. They were terrified. They stayed terrified the entire time they were there. A tunnel is not a tunnel until it's finished. And until it's finished, it's nothing but a dark cave. And the only light they had was some small homemade candles that the injured convicts would make from pig fat. And they stunk, but they provided a little bit of light. And then some of the convicts would be the ones sent in to pick up the broken rock and carry it out. Imagine picking up a jagged, large rock that weighs 30, 35 pounds and carrying it in the dark on a rough floor that's jagged and uneven and slanted and you're carrying it the distance of 2 football fields. And it's poking into your belly. It's poking into your arms, and you're bleeding, but you can't put it down. You've got to carry it out. You could recognize at a distance the convicts who had that job because the fronts of their clothing were red or burgundy from dried blood. This was a brutal, severe job. A comment was made about their food. An average day's ration of food for convicts was 1/2 pound bacon, 22 ounces of cornmeal, and either 1/3 of a pound of peas or 1 pound of potatoes. That's a day. That's not one meal. That's a day. They were given coffee at breakfast made of 1 part coffee to 4 parts rye. I've never tasted coffee like that, and I don't ever plan to. I'm sure it was nasty. Sometimes it was some molasses put in it. Another comment was made, the work was so hard that in many instances, convicts would be willing to undergo punishment to avoid the work. And one of the legislators made the comment, prison guards were paid $13 a month on the Mountain Division, and they were paid $25 a month in Raleigh. So much of the cost, now here this is a quote, much of the cost of keeping these creatures is greater in Raleigh than in the mountains. Creatures, that's what they thought the convicts were. They were African Americans. The skin color was different, so therefore they were creatures. And my research that I did, because we wanted to know, and we couldn't find precise answers. So once the material was made available to the public, I went down and spent a week, as Dr. Waters mentioned, and I went through every page. The book, I'm going to hold you up a picture. This proves that I was there, and that's the book. That book has got entries of 5,601 convicts. Not all of them were on the Western North Carolina Railroad. Those were specifically identified. And I'll show you also what it looked like opening up that book. There were 13 columns on the left side, 13 columns on the right side, and 23 lines of individual names written. This is a close-up. I have circled and read those who died or who were killed. The bottom one here, killed trying to escape. There are several in there like that. Not lots of detail. The ones underlined in green were pardoned. That just means, in my mind, the person for whom they worked had some connections and wanted to get them back working for them and not working for the state. Here's one more page where I've circled those who died and underlined those who escaped. This was so brutal that many tried to escape. There was one fellow from Mecklenburg County. His name was Bob Wilson. He was convicted for larceny and sentenced in August 1875. He worked for a year, and in August of 1876, he escaped from the Mountain Division. He was gone 10 months, and somehow he was captured and sent back to the mountain. So he worked for about 8 months, and he ran again. This time, he was only gone 4 days, and they brought him back, and he worked for another 7 or 8 months, and he escaped again June 30th, 1878. He was gone over a year, and captured again. I can't imagine, but they brought him back, and he escaped again. For him, 4 times was a charm, because the 4th time he escaped, they didn't catch him. So that tells you this was horrible stuff that they were going through. Now, I want to get to the numbers because in the book on the far right column, there was simply the initials WNCRR for those prisoners who were assigned to the Western North Carolina Railroad. And at that time frame, between 1875 and 1879, the prisoners assigned to the Western North Carolina Railroad were working on the Mountain Division because that's what was happening at that time. Of the 5,601 names in that marvelously exciting and yet dreadful book, only 311 names are identified as being assigned to the Western North Carolina Railroad. 311. What that tells me is there's a lot more information out there that we do not yet have. And part of that is based upon the numbers that I found doing my research 50 years ago, which tells us that on December 26, 1876, there were 371 convicts working on the mountain that day when there was a head count. November the 1st, 1878, 558 convicts working that day. February the 1st, 1879, 541 convicts that day. All total, there were probably between 3,000 and 3,500 convicts, a great deal more than we have available in this book of 5,601. Now, how many of them died? That's something that people are curious about. 91 of the 311 died doing the work. Now, it does not explain in significant detail how they died. There are several entries that do explain that some of these deaths occurred when a guard shot them and killed them for trying to escape. Surprisingly, maybe not, but it's sort of surprising. There were some where a little bit of detail showed that one convict managed to get a hold of the gun from one of the guards and killed another convict. So there was interpersonal relations challenges going on up there on the mountain, as you might imagine. Others died from illness. There was a doctor who says he was up there regularly. Whether that's so, I have some skepticism, or the effectiveness of what he did certainly was not great. But 91 deaths. Of these convicts, we have information in this book, and I'll read you the headings of these columns so you know what's in the book. First, their name. Let me pause to say this. For years, truly for years, I've been putting on a one-man show until I had vocal cord problems. About 6 years ago, I had to stop doing it. But I would dress up in a convict costume, and I would do a one-man program where I would talk for an hour from the point of view of a convict, of saying what it was like, based on my research of 50 years, to work on this mountain division. And one thing I said repeatedly was, these convicts were so little regarded that their names were not even recorded. And I said that because I had searched and searched and came up dry. I found no names. And then in the last year, when I learned about the existence of this book that is now at the North Carolina Archives office in Raleigh, it's worth your trip just to look at that book, quite honestly. But I learned about that, and I had talked with John Ager. He and I were co-chairman of another committee And I had talked with him a lot about what we were doing and how we were frustrated at not being able to get information. This was going on probably about the same time the professors Keith and Kerberg from Warren Wilson were doing their conversation as well. So perhaps that had some impact on getting these names released. But what's in the book is their name. That's the first thing listed is their name, where they were born, where they last lived, their level of education. Mostly it said none. Occupation, most of them said laborer. There were some who had some skilled jobs. There was one school teacher included in these convicts. Several that were listed as wagoneers. Not quite sure what a wagoneer is. I suppose someone who works on wagons or builds them. Age, gender, or sex. They didn't say the word gender. Color, merit. Now, in color, you would think it would be black or white. Well, that was, but many of them had copper. And I thought, well, that surprised me to see copper as one of the colors listed. Marital status, height, eye color, hair color. Every one, I think, was black for hair color. Where they were tried, what county, when their sentence was to expire, when they were administered their sentence, and the day they actually entered the prison system, the length of their sentence, the offense for which they were convicted. Now that I found particularly interesting. About 99% list larceny. My understanding from other materials that I had read was, as Dan mentioned earlier, vagrancy. Almost, I'm exaggerating when I say this facetiously, but not much more evidence than breathing while black. Not being employed was an offense referred to. But when it got to the courts, they didn't have those small minor offenses. Larceny is what's listed in 99% of them. They had a notation if they had any previous imprisonments. And then how released. That's the section where it would be either discharged, and if so, the date was written in. If they died, the date that they died. If they were pardoned, the date that they were pardoned. And so this is what is present in that information. The youngest of the prisoners was 14. 14. The oldest was 68. If you go and look at this, and if you're interested, I encourage you to do it. Do not be surprised if you get emotional. I get emotional reading this and talking about it because it was so horrible. It was a wonderful thing that happened. The railroad is the reason that Western North Carolina was developed and lives were improved for 100 years because of the railroad. But what it took to get that railroad, we now know a lot more of what happened. And I am grateful to the North Carolina Department of Cultural and Natural Resources, and in particular to the Division of Archives and History, for being the guardian of this information, which is so vital for a full understanding of our past. And now I'll be happy to answer questions if there are any.
So Steve, we do have some questions for you and Dan. One is about the women who were working there, which is maybe a surprise for everyone. And if you have any idea how the work was structured for the women.
The work was done what you would imagine stereotypically. The women did the cooking and the women did laundry. Laundry meant they went down to Mill Creek and with the nasty clothes and just flopped them around in the stream. There was no soap. for things like that. Some of the men did cooking as well, because there weren't enough women to do the cooking.
John Ely does speculate that the women were also used as sex workers, I guess, for lack of a better term. And there is, Ann Chesky found an account of actually where one woman tried to poison one of the guards and kind of lead an escape. So that's an interesting story as well. And we do know about that, but it's just speculation about the sexual aspect of it.
Any others, Adrian?
Yeah, and everyone, sorry, my screen's purple. I see it too, but I have no idea how to fix it. Anyway, we had a question and a comment about the story of Bob Wilson, who escaped 4 times, and just wondering if you have any other details about what he was doing, where he went when he escaped, and how he was caught.
I would love to know the answers to those questions, but I don't. I do want you to consider this, however, for convicts whose term of service ended while they were working on the mountain. They wanted to go home. They had to buy a ticket. They had no money. How would they get home? How did they know where home was? They would start walking on the railroad track, wearing the only clothing they had, their black and white stripes. How far do you think they got? What do you think their life was like? When their term of sentence was over, their terror was not over.
Adrian, I saw 2 more questions come in. One, Dan and Steve, are there more programs around this? I know that this is a project that took on a life of its own, right? And I know you saw the completion of one thing to get that monument done, but it grew into so much more. And so what is next? And I know our state archivist, Sarah Kuntz, has asked a question about what might be next.
The next thing will be the historic panels. Past that, we have talked about putting some markers up with names of the individuals. We're actually trying to wind down here, but it's been a wonderful run, and I will say that the support we've had and just financially, Norfolk Southern has come through in a big way. They won't let us take the dogs onto their property, unfortunately, but they've been very supportive financially, and there just been so many people who have stepped up. And I think, Sarah, I'll also ask about publication. Steve has a book already and has done a 2nd edition recently. You want to hold that up? And there will be an article coming out in the North Carolina Historical Review about the project by Ashley Whittle. And I guess I'm at liberty to share this. But Jeff Keith and Kevin Kerberg have a book contract, and hopefully soon. They've done a lot of work on this, and there will be a book soon, relatively soon, about their research and kind of the story of researching this. And I see a message from Ann Chesky, who's working on researching the women that are listed in the state archives records, and there's some fascinating. And Ann is the one who found this story about the poisoning that took place, and so there are a number of follow-up things that are coming, and so a lot of new information out there. It's very exciting.
Mm-hmm. Well, Adrian, I'll turn over to you. Any additional questions you want to ask Dan and Steve while we have them here? Or...
So we do have a couple more questions. I think this one's a little more of a detail question, but do we know why the coffee was made the way it was?
Cheap. It was cheaper to get rye and grind the rye seed than it was to get coffee.
Steve, what was the number I recall is like 6 cents a day or something, that the allocation for feeding, clothing, housing, medical care, all that, was it
My recollection, it was 29 cents a day.
29 cents a day?
29 cents a day was what the prison system calculated that it cost to maintain the prisoners up on the mountain.
And
You
so
know,
in the-
Steve, Steve, one of the things in your presentation, I know you emphasized and about how challenging and trying and terrible this kind of period of history is. And I know that there's a book that has been written about this called Worse Than Slavery. And so that's it could take us down a whole nother path to kind of tease out exactly what people mean by that. But this was, it's that is a component that people have been exploring in their research. Am I correct?
That is correct. As a matter of fact, in my revised edition of this book, I put in a postscript and I talk about the convict leasing system. This technically was not convict leasing because it was the state using its wards. So the state wasn't paying anybody, but they were getting the benefit of their free labor. But it was the equivalent of convict leasing, which in my opinion was worse than slavery. The slave owners knew when to stop. They knew when to let the workers rest. Not so on the mountain. They had a deadline they needed to get done. And if one of them dropped dead from exhaustion or a rock fell on them and killed them in the cave before it became a tunnel, they'd be replaced with another person.
There's a quote from a South Carolina legislator that's the title of another book on convict leases: "One dies, get another." And that was the attitude in many ways. So it was there, there was no financial investment. The state didn't, there were plenty of people to round up for labor. And so, under slavery, there was a financial investment there, and so you had at least some interest in maintaining the health of your enslaved person. There wasn't much incentive here. And so in many ways it was worse than slavery.
Any counties that you all noticed sending more convicts to this project?
The one that surprised me was Halifax. There were a lot of the prisoners in the book. A lot of the 311 were from Halifax County. Richmond County produced a lot. Mecklenburg, not nearly as many as I would have expected. I suspect that probably, or perhaps one reason that there weren't more names in the book is the counties closer to the Mountain Division could have just sent their prisoners straight to the mountain and not gone first to Raleigh for processing, only to have to ship them back again. And that could account for very few. I found one person, though, from Buncombe County in the book, but I suspect there were a great deal more from mountain counties that went straight to the site instead of being processed.
And Steve, you mentioned Halifax County, and immediately I think of the fact that it had a sizable African American population too. That's one of those counties where you have, and that essentially probably tells us something about what was going on in those particular counties.
Yes.
And then one last question about individual stories and how you're really piecing those together. Is it mostly from newspaper records?
That's a lot of it, yes. Ann Chesky has done a marvelous job, and I can't express enough gratitude for her determination and her tenacious spirit of seeking the truth and seeking information. She's done a marvelous job. Ashley Whittle, likewise, a marvelous job of research and dedication to doing this. So, but they have found a lot of information, some that I had never found, and I value so much what both Ann and Ashley have done.
Well, and one thing, now that we have names, and it can get to be a very tangled, there's some real ethical issues here, but genealogical research is now a possibility. And I'm sure that will happen, although you have to be very careful about how you go about that. But that's enough. Some of that has been done, and you know, and finding out details of what happened to a lot of these people. Do they appear in subsequent censuses? That type of thing. What are they doing? So we're starting to flesh out a little bit about the personal lives of people.
And so have you tried to contact any descendants, or is that a next step?
We are not going down that path, and so but there are some people who are, I think, but that's not something that the Rail Project is pursuing. But now that these records are available, it is something that people can do.
That could be a spin-off project for other groups.
And again, and that's also something that was important to us. And you know, I've encouraged colleagues who are at research institutions, you know, say, here's a great, and actually there's some very exciting work being done at Chapel Hill, actually, in the archaeology department, a graduate students doing work on the stockades, and again, you know, we're one of the things we wanted to do were to encourage other folks to jump in and do research and try and flesh out this story, you know, and give us more of the human side of the story, not just statistics.
Okay, well, we're kind of past our.
Well, just real quickly, Kayla, hi Kayla. Kayla Kochelscher has put her contact information there. She's the one doing the work at UNC Chapel Hill on this. So yeah, if you're interested in learning more, contact Kayla.
Well, it's certainly an impressive scholarly collaboration. It seems like people, maybe Steve started this 50 years ago, but so many other people have been part of the team getting this story built over time. It's amazing. And thank you so much for sharing it with us today and with our audience. And Darin, did you have any final thoughts to share before we close it out?
Yeah, well, thank you, Adrian. Just again to thank Dan and Steve and the whole team for the work that they've done around this. And I'll just warn people that if you see Dan Pierce coming to ask you to do something, just know that if you commit to it, you're going to be involved with it for a while. So word to the wise. But this has been a great project. Dan, good to see you, and good to see you too, Steve. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.